It was 1999, and New York City was in the middle of a crime spree unlike any it had ever seen. Luxury cars, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, and BMWs were vanishing off the streets. No broken glass, no alarms, and no sign of forced entry. Within weeks, 48 high-end vehicles had disappeared into thin air. Police were baffled. Normally, even the most professional car thieves left some kind of trace. A stripped-down frame, a discarded license plate, something. But this time, there was nothing. It was as if the cars had simply evaporated. What the authorities didn't know was that they weren't just dealing with car thieves. Behind the scenes was a mastermind, someone operating with surgical precision, someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deception and evasion. This wasn't an ordinary criminal. This was Min Jin Yang, a former Chinese intelligence officer who had turned his military expertise into a multi-million-dollar criminal empire. From the outside, he looked like an ordinary immigrant, quiet, unassuming, and driving an old Nissan Altima. But in reality, he was running the largest car theft ring in American history.
They do it in a matter of moments. They are sophisticated. They know the latest technology on these high-end cars.
How did he do it? How did a man who once served in the Chinese military end up stealing cars in New York? And why did it take law enforcement years to even realize he existed? This is the story of how one man, armed with nothing but his wits and military training, outsmarted the police, built a fortune, and became America's most elusive car thief. It all started in Shanghai, China. Before he became one of the most elusive criminals in American history, Min Jin Yang was a loyal soldier in the Chinese military. As an intelligence officer, Jin Yang was trained in tactics that most people wouldn't even dream of. Covert operations, surveillance, smuggling, and, most importantly, how to operate undetected. For years, his job was to outsmart his enemies, and he excelled at it. But in 1990, his career took an unexpected turn. Jin Yang was discharged from the military. The reasons for his departure remain unclear, but one thing is certain: he wasn't ready to fade into obscurity. Armed with a unique set of skills and a sharp mind, he began looking for his next opportunity. And in the bustling city of Shanghai, he found it. In the early 1990s, Shanghai was transforming into a playground for the wealthy. The streets were lined with luxury shops, high-end restaurants, and affluent businessmen. But there was one problem. China's restrictive import policies made luxury cars nearly impossible to find. If you wanted a Lamborghini or a Porsche, you couldn't buy it in China. But Jin Yang saw this as a gap in the market, a gap he could exploit. He approached a local gang leader with a bold proposal. Using his expertise in smuggling and evasion, Jin Yang promised to bring luxury cars into China. The gang would handle the sales, and they'd split the profits. The gang leader, seeing the potential for massive gains, trusted him and handed Jin Yang $500,000 to set up the operation. But Jin Yang wasn't planning to run his business from China. He knew that to source the kind of cars his clients wanted, he needed to go straight to the source. And there was no better place than New York City, a city overflowing with wealth, luxury, and exactly the kind of vehicles his customers craved. With $500,000 in hand, Jin Yang left China and arrived in New York under a new identity. He called himself Kenny, a struggling immigrant just trying to make a living. To blend in, he dressed modestly, drove an old car, and lived a quiet life. But behind the scenes, he was laying the groundwork for an operation that would eventually outsmart even the most seasoned detectives. Jin Yang's first step was to secure a base of operations, a warehouse where stolen cars could be stored and prepared for export. But it couldn't be just any warehouse. It had to be in a quiet, low-crime area far from the prying eyes of law enforcement. After weeks of scouting, he found the perfect spot. And to ensure no one suspected its true purpose, he staged it as a food storage facility, complete with boxes of dry goods stacked at the entrance. With his base secured, Jin Yang turned his attention to building a team. He wasn't looking for flashy criminals or reckless thieves. He needed people he could trust, people who shared his culture, his language, and his discipline. His first recruit was Poi Chia, a fellow Chinese immigrant who would become his right-hand man. Together, they began assembling the pieces of a network that would soon become one of the most sophisticated car theft operations in history. And yet, as meticulous as Jin Yang was, this was only the beginning. What came next would turn him from a quiet immigrant into the leader of an empire. With a discreet warehouse secured and his right-hand man Poi Chia by his side, Min Jin Yang began laying the foundation for his operation. The next step was building a team that could carry out his vision with precision. But Jin Yang had no interest in working with just anyone. He wanted professionals who could execute his plans flawlessly while keeping their mouths shut. Instead of diving into the world of petty criminals, Jin Yang turned to the city's underground car scene. It was there he met Dean, a veteran car thief who had been running small-time thefts for years. Jin Yang wasn't looking for a thief. He was looking for a network, and Dean had just that. Dean wasn't flashy, but he was reliable and knew exactly who to bring into the fold. Dean introduced Jin Yang to his longtime associate, Mario Lopez, a technician with extraordinary talent for breaking into cars. Mario wasn't just a thief, he was an artist. While most thieves relied on brute force, Mario had mastered the art of using technology to bypass even the most advanced security systems. For Jin Yang, he wasn't just an asset, he was the key to the entire operation. But Jin Yang's genius lay not in the team he built, but in how he structured it. At no point was anyone allowed to interact directly with him, unless absolutely necessary. Orders flowed down a chain of command, creating layers of separation. Dean handled recruitment and operational logistics, while Mario focused on training and theft execution. Jin Yang stayed in the background, carefully orchestrating every move without leaving fingerprints on the operation. What set this network apart wasn't just its organization, it was its efficiency. The team didn't operate on impulse. Every target was pre-selected, researched, and tracked. Luxury vehicles parked in high-end neighborhoods were scouted in advance. Thieves worked in pairs, ensuring a stolen car could be moved quickly and quietly without drawing attention. Once the vehicles reached the warehouse, the operation became even more refined. Cars weren't just hidden, they were transformed. Mario's technical expertise came into play as he worked with a specialized crew to reprogram computers, remove tracking devices, and even create duplicate keys. Every vehicle left the warehouse looking as if it had just rolled off a showroom floor, ready to be shipped across the Pacific. Jin Yang also took steps to ensure that even his closest associates were kept in the dark about the bigger picture. For Dean and Mario, the operation was about stealing cars. For Poi Chia and the warehouse team, it was about preparing shipments. But only Jin Yang knew how the pieces fit together. This secrecy wasn't just paranoia, it was strategy. With every layer of his operation in place, Jin Yang's machine began to churn. Cars disappeared off the streets of New York with alarming regularity. And yet no one, not even the thieves themselves, could link the crimes back to him. Jin Yang had created the perfect cover, and for years, it worked. Once Jin Yang's network was in place, the operation kicked into high gear. At the heart of their success was a method so efficient and precise that it left investigators completely in the dark. Luxury cars vanished as if by magic, and not a single piece of evidence was left behind. The thefts began with meticulous scouting. Mario Lopez, the technical mastermind of the operation, didn't just pick cars at random. His team identified specific targets: high-end vehicles parked in affluent neighborhoods, luxury malls, or private garages. These were places where thefts might go unnoticed for hours, sometimes days. Mario's philosophy was simple. If the car wasn't worth at least six figures, it wasn't worth the risk. When the time came to steal a vehicle, Mario's crew worked like clockwork. There was no smashing windows or jamming locks. Instead, they used advanced tools, laptops, and custom software to bypass the car's security systems. In under a minute, the car's alarm was disabled, the locks were overridden, and the engine was ready to start. It wasn't just theft, it was a surgical operation. But even after the cars were taken, Jin Yang's paranoia ensured the process was far from over. The vehicles were parked in upscale neighborhoods, surrounded by other luxury cars, and left untouched for 48 hours. This wasn't a delay, it was a test. By leaving the car in a high-end area, the gang could determine whether it had a GPS tracker or if law enforcement was already onto them. If the car remained undisturbed after 2 days, it was considered safe to move. Once cleared, the vehicles were transported to the warehouse. Here, Jin Yang's obsession with perfection took over. The cars weren't just hidden, they were prepared. GPS trackers, if still present, were removed and destroyed. Locks were repaired, scratches buffed out, and software systems reprogrammed. By the time a car left the warehouse, it looked brand new, almost indistinguishable from when it had first been sold. The next challenge was shipping the cars overseas, and this is where Jin Yang's military background truly shone. He used a network of fake shipping companies to create clean paperwork, labeling the containers as food or industrial goods. But Jin Yang didn't stop there. The containers were routed through multiple ports, often traveling across the country before being loaded onto ships. To avoid suspicion, the final shipments were never direct. Containers were transferred from one ship to another in international waters, with the second ship carrying detailed manifests that listed the true contents, high-end luxury vehicles bound for China. This step was critical. By the time the cars arrived in China, there was no trace of their origins or the crimes that had put them there. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Over the course of 5 years, Jin Yang's network stole thousands of cars and generated millions in profits. But what truly set it apart wasn't just the money, it was the precision. Every detail from the scouting to the shipping was orchestrated with military-grade precision. For Jin Yang, this wasn't just a business, it was a symphony, and he was the conductor. And for years, law enforcement had no idea who was behind it. To them, it seemed impossible. How could so many cars disappear without a trace? What they didn't realize was that the answer wasn't just in the stolen vehicles, but in the mind of the man who had turned car theft into an art form. By the late 1990s, the New York Police Department knew they had a problem. High-end cars were disappearing at an unprecedented rate, and despite their best efforts, they had nothing to show for it. There were no chop shops, no stripped-down frames, no parts being sold on the black market. Every lead they chased turned into a dead end. The thefts seemed almost too perfect. Even seasoned investigators, used to tracking down elusive car rings, were left scratching their heads. Months turned into years, and the pressure to solve the case kept mounting. But every time the police thought they were closing in, the trail went cold. Surveillance of suspected car theft hotspots yielded nothing. Informants in the criminal underworld had no answers. And as the stolen car count climbed into the hundreds, the case became a source of embarrassment for the department. Then, one night, luck, or perhaps fate, intervened. A stolen car, driven recklessly through the streets, crashed into another vehicle. The driver survived, but was arrested at the scene. At first, the officers thought it was just another small-time car thief, but during questioning, the suspect began to talk. Under pressure, he revealed something that would change everything. He wasn't working alone. He was part of a much larger operation. The suspect provided names, most notably Dean, the man responsible for coordinating the thefts. For the first time, the police had a lead. But they knew better than to act too quickly. They needed to build their case carefully, piece by piece, if they had any hope of taking down the organization as a whole. They began by placing Dean under surveillance. Day and night, detectives tracked his every move. But Dean was no amateur. He avoided patterns, rarely used the same routes, and kept his circle of contacts tight. Every step he took seemed designed to frustrate the police. And yet, even Dean couldn't see everything. Over time, investigators began to notice a pattern in his behavior. Certain places he frequented, certain people he met with. One of those people was Mario Lopez, the technical genius behind the thefts. Through wiretaps and hidden cameras, the police started to unravel how the operation worked. But there was still one glaring problem. No one knew who was running the show. Dean and Mario were clearly important, but they didn't seem like the type to mastermind something of this scale. There had to be someone above them. That someone, of course, was Min Jin Yang, or as the police knew him at the time, Kenny. But Jin Yang was a ghost. He never visited the warehouse, never showed his face to the lower-level thieves, and never left a trace that could lead back to him. Even his phone calls were cryptic, using coded language to avoid detection. The police's frustration was palpable. Every time they got close, Jin Yang seemed to slip through their fingers. Surveillance of the warehouse turned up nothing but food deliveries. Wiretaps revealed vague instructions but no actionable evidence. It was as if Jin Yang knew exactly what they were doing. And, in many cases, he did. But the turning point came when investigators decided to step up their game. They installed hidden cameras around the suspected warehouse and even planted GPS trackers on shipping containers leaving the site. For the first time, they were able to track the stolen car's journey, not just across the city, but across the country. It was a slow and grueling process. Jin Yang's operation was so layered, so meticulously designed, that every new discovery raised more questions than answers. But piece by piece, the police were closing the gap. They didn't know it yet, but the noose was starting to tighten. For years, Min Jin Yang's operation had run like a well-oiled machine. Every car theft was meticulously planned, every shipment flawlessly executed. The police were always a step behind, chasing shadows while Jin Yang's empire continued to grow. But like all things, perfection has a breaking point. And for Jin Yang's gang, that point was arrogance. By the early 2000s, the operation had become so successful that caution began to slip. What had started as a carefully orchestrated symphony of precision turned into a high-volume business. The gang wasn't just stealing cars. They were stealing more cars faster than ever before. And with that came mistakes. One of those mistakes began with a simple deviation from protocol. For years, Jin Yang's strict rules dictated that every stolen car had to be vetted, parked in a neutral location, monitored for days, and thoroughly inspected for tracking devices. But the sheer demand for vehicles in China began to push the gang to cut corners. Instead of vetting the cars, they started transporting them directly to the warehouse as soon as they were stolen. This change might have gone unnoticed if it weren't for a single oversight. One of the stolen cars, a high-end BMW, still had an active GPS tracker. When its owner reported the theft, the police activated the tracker and followed the signal straight to the gang's warehouse, the nerve center of Jin Yang's entire operation. Inside were not only stolen cars, but the tools, equipment, and personnel needed to prepare them for shipment. If the police moved too soon, they risked losing everything. So instead, they watched. What the gang didn't realize was that the warehouse was now under 24/7 surveillance. Hidden cameras recorded every movement. Investigators intercepted calls and tracked every vehicle that entered or left the premises. The once impenetrable operation was now a fishbowl, with every detail laid bare to the authorities. Yet even as the police gathered evidence, Jin Yang's crew continued to make mistakes. For years, their strict hierarchy had kept them safe. Lower-level thieves never knew the bigger picture, and even key players like Dean and Mario were kept in the dark about Jin Yang's true role. But with the gang growing bolder, communication became sloppy. Calls that had once been carefully coded now included slip-ups, names, and locations. One particularly careless conversation revealed a new warehouse the gang was planning to use as a secondary base. Investigators quickly planted surveillance devices there, further tightening the net around Jin Yang's operation. But even as the police closed in, they knew they had to tread carefully. Jin Yang had evaded them for years, and they couldn't afford to spook him now. For Jin Yang, the writing might have been on the wall, but his confidence in his system kept him moving forward. He believed his layers of insulation would protect him, that the police would never connect the dots. What he didn't anticipate was just how persistent and patient law enforcement can be. The mistakes piled up. Vehicles were moved too quickly without the usual precautions. Conversations that should have been cryptic became careless. And while Jin Yang himself remained cautious, his associates began to falter under the growing pressure. Every new slip-up brought the police closer to the mastermind they had been chasing for years. By the time Jin Yang realized the extent of the danger, it was too late. The police weren't just watching, they were preparing to strike. The gang's critical errors had given investigators everything they needed to dismantle the operation piece by piece. And as the net tightened, even Jin Yang's military-grade tactics couldn't keep him out of their grasp. The warehouse raid was swift and decisive. After months of painstaking surveillance and countless false starts, the police were ready to strike. A team of heavily armed officers surrounded the site in the early hours of the morning, waiting for the perfect moment to move in. Inside, Jin Yang's workers were busy as usual, preparing another shipment of stolen cars. What they didn't know was that their every move had already been recorded, and their time was running out. The raid began with a loud crash as the doors were forced open. Officers stormed the building, catching the workers completely off guard. Within minutes, the entire crew was in custody, and the police began cataloging the evidence. Luxury cars in pristine condition, stacks of counterfeit shipping manifests, and tools designed to reprogram vehicle systems. But one thing was missing: Jin Yang himself. While his operation was being dismantled, Jin Yang was miles away, unaware that the game was over. But the police had anticipated this. Using months of surveillance data, they had tracked Jin Yang's movements and pinpointed his residence. As the raid on the warehouse unfolded, another team of officers moved in on his home. Jin Yang was arrested without incident, caught as he was leaving his house for what he likely thought was just another day of business. It was only during his interrogation that the full extent of his operation began to come into focus. The man the police knew as Kenny was in fact Min Jin Yang, a former Chinese intelligence officer with a history of smuggling and evasion. For years, he had used the skills he had honed in the military to run a criminal enterprise that had generated tens of millions of dollars. But while Jin Yang was finally in custody, the victory felt hollow. Despite the evidence collected from the warehouse, investigators still couldn't account for the vast majority of the stolen cars. Most had already been shipped overseas, their exact destinations buried under layers of fake paperwork and misdirection. Even Jin Yang's personal finances were untouchable. His profits had been carefully funneled out of the United States, likely to accounts in China that the authorities had no jurisdiction to access. In the end, Jin Yang was charged with enterprise corruption, a crime that carried a relatively light sentence given the scale of his operation. He received just 10 years in prison, a punishment that seemed almost laughable for a man who had orchestrated the theft of thousands of luxury vehicles and amassed a fortune estimated at over $75 million. To this day, not a single dollar of that money has been recovered.